On a sunny morning at the bustling Atlanta International Airport, the terminal hummed with energy. Travelers hurried through security lines, clutching their boarding passes and carry-ons, eager to reach their destinations. Amid this sea of faces was Danielle Carter, a poised and confident black woman dressed in a chic navy pantsuit. She had a warm smile that could light up a room, but today, her smile held a mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just any flight for Danielle. It was the culmination of months of planning. A business trip that could redefine her career. Danielle approached the airline counter, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. She had booked a first-class ticket, a small reward to herself for years of relentless hard work. As she stepped up to the counter, the flight attendant on duty, a tall woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a polished uniform, glanced at her briefly before her expression hardened. "Good morning," Danielle said, handing over her ID and confirmation email. The flight attendant, whose name tag read *Miss Fletcher*, barely acknowledged her greeting. Instead, she scrutinized Danielle's documents with an air of doubt. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Miss Fletcher said curtly. "There seemed to be an issue with your booking." Danielle's smile faltered. "An issue? That's strange. I booked this ticket weeks ago, and everything should be fine." Miss Fletcher sighed dramatically and shook her head. "We're overbooked, and I'm afraid you won't be able to board this flight. I'll have to move you to standby." Danielle frowned, her voice calm but firm. "I don't understand. I have a confirmed ticket in first class. How is that possible?" The flight attendant's tone turned icy. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules. If you'd like, you can wait over there until we figure something out." She gestured dismissively toward a corner of the terminal. Danielle's heart sank as the frustration began to rise. She wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but she couldn't help noticing how differently Ms. Fletcher had treated the passengers before her, most of whom didn't look like her. They were greeted with smiles and courtesy, their tickets processed without question. Yet here she was, being brushed off as though she were invisible. "Is there a manager I can speak with?" Danielle asked, determined to resolve the situation. Ms. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "The manager is busy, ma'am. You'll just have to wait." Feeling the stares of other passengers, Danielle moved aside, her cheeks burning with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She knew she deserved better, but confronting the situation head-on seemed futile. Taking a deep breath, she decided to call the airline's customer service to escalate the matter. While she dialed the number, her mind raced with thoughts. Was this really about overbooking, or was something more insidious at play? Minutes turned into what felt like an eternity as Danielle waited on hold. Meanwhile, she noticed Miss Fletcher assisting other passengers with a smile that seemed reserved for everyone but her. Danielle wasn't sure whether to feel infuriated or defeated, but she resolved to stay calm. Just as she was about to step away and collect herself, an older gentleman in a sharp grey suit approached the counter. He appeared to be a high-ranking airline employee, exuding authority with every step. Ms. Fletcher's demeanor changed instantly. She straightened her posture, her voice suddenly warm and accommodating. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her tone dripping with respect. Danielle's ears perked up. Was this her chance to plead her case? Before she could say a word, Miss Fletcher leaned toward Mr. Reynolds and whispered something, glancing briefly in Danielle's direction. Whatever she said made Mr. Reynolds frown. He turned to look at Danielle, his expression unreadable, before walking toward her. "Miss Carter, is it?" he asked, his voice even and professional. Danielle nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand there's been a problem with your ticket. Would you mind stepping aside with me for a moment so we can discuss this privately?" Danielle followed him a short distance away, her pulse quickening. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening here, something she wasn't yet privy to. Mr. Reynolds glanced around to ensure no one was listening before speaking. "I want to apologize for the inconvenience," he began, his tone measured. "However, I've just been informed that there's an issue with your ticket verification." Danielle's stomach churned. "Issue? What kind of issue?" I can't go into details right now, he said, his voice lowering. But I assure you, we're looking into it. Please bear with us for a few more minutes. Danielle's frustration bubbled over. With all due respect, Mr. Reynolds, I've been patient. I've been polite. But I have a first-class ticket that I paid for, and I deserve to know why I'm being treated like this. Before Mr. Reynolds could respond, a commotion erupted near the gate. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening as a tall, distinguished man in his early 50s walked briskly toward the counter. His presence was commanding, his tailored suit and confident stride drawing every eye in the room. It was none other than James Harrington, the CEO of the airline. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. Why was the CEO here? And why did he look so determined? Miss Fletcher's face paled as she spotted him. Mr. Harrington, she stammered, I wasn't expecting you. Clearly, he interrupted, his voice cold and authoritative. Step aside, Miss Fletcher. The room fell silent as Mr. Harrington approached Danielle directly. Miss Carter, he said, extending a hand, I deeply apologize for what you've experienced today. Please, allow me to personally escort you to your seat. Danielle stared at him stunned. Was this really happening? What had caused such a dramatic turn in events? As she followed Mr. Harrington toward the gate, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth behind the morning's events was about to unravel, and it would leave everyone speechless. Danielle followed Mr. Harrington through the crowded terminal, still in disbelief at the sudden turn of events. Whispers rippled through the passengers, some craning their necks to get a better look. It wasn't every day that the CEO of the major airline showed up unannounced, let alone personally intervened in a situation like this. But while the eyes of others were filled with curiosity, Danielle's mind was spinning. Why had Mr. Harrington appeared out of nowhere? What had triggered such an extraordinary response? And most importantly, why had she been singled out in the first place? As they reached the gate, Mr. Harrington paused and turned to Danielle, his face etched with an intensity that suggested he wasn't just here to smooth things over. Miss Carter, he began, his voice steady but low enough to ensure privacy. I want to make it clear that what happened earlier is not representative of our airline's values. There are matters that I need to address internally, but rest assured, your experience today will not go unresolved. Danielle raised an eyebrow, confused. I appreciate that, Mr. Harrington, but I still don't understand. Why was I told there was an issue with my ticket? Why was I treated so differently? His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked as though he was carefully choosing his words. There's more to this situation than meets the eye, he said cryptically. I'll explain what I can after you've been seated comfortably. Please trust me on this. The uncertainty in his tone left Danielle with more questions than answers, but she nodded. If nothing else, Mr. Harrington's presence seemed genuine, and his words carried a weight of authority that was hard to ignore. As he gestured for her to proceed through the gate, she noticed Miss Fletcher standing stiffly at her post, her face flushed with what appeared to be both embarrassment and fear. The tables had turned, but Danielle couldn't quite relish the moment. Something about the whole situation felt far too complex to celebrate just yet. Moments later, Danielle settled into her first-class seat near the front of the plane. The spacious cabin and plush leather upholstery were a stark contrast to the tension she'd just experienced. Flight attendants bustled up and down the aisle, ensuring passengers were comfortable, but Danielle couldn't help but notice that none of them made eye contact with her. It was as though an invisible spotlight had been placed on her, isolating her from the rest of the passengers. She glanced out the window, hoping the view of the tarmac would help calm her racing thoughts. But just as the engines roared to life, Mr. Harrington reappeared, stepping into the cabin and walking directly to her seat. The other passengers exchanged curious glances, their murmurs barely audible over the hum of the plane. Miss Carter, he said, leaning down slightly so only she could hear. I'd like to speak with you privately after we've taken off. There's a lot you deserve to know, and I want to ensure you hear it from me directly. Danielle nodded, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension. All right, she said quietly. I'll wait. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Danielle replayed the events of the morning in her mind. She thought about the way Miss Fletcher had looked at her, the dismissive tone in her voice, and the excuse of an overbooked flight that made no sense. It wasn't the first time Danielle had encountered subtle forms of discrimination, but something about this experience felt different. It wasn't just about one flight attendant's behavior, it felt bigger, more deliberate. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Mr. Harrington returned, gesturing for Danielle to follow him to the small conference room reserved for first-class passengers. The room was designed for privacy, with a sleep table and comfortable chairs, but its luxurious atmosphere did little to ease Danielle's nerves. Once they were seated, Mr. Harrington leaned forward, his expression serious. "I owe you an explanation," he began, folding his hands on the table. "What happened at the gate wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was the result of internal policies that, frankly, should never have existed in the first place." Danielle's brow furrowed. "Policies? What kind of policies?" Mr. Harrington sighed, rubbing his temples. "Let's just say there have been ongoing issues within our organization. Biases, practices, and attitudes that we've been working to root out. This morning's incident brought those issues to light in a way that couldn't be ignored." Danielle's heart sank. "Are you saying this happened because of who I am?" "I'm afraid so," Mr. Harrington admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But I want to make something very clear. We are taking immediate action to address this. The behavior you experienced was unacceptable, and the individuals responsible will be held accountable." Danielle stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, disappointment, and disbelief. "Do you know how humiliating that was for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To be treated like I didn't belong? Like I wasn't good enough?" Mr. Harrington nodded solemnly. "I can't begin to imagine how that felt, and I won't pretend that an apology is enough to make it right. But please believe me when I say that changes are already underway. What happened today won't be swept under the rug." Danielle's eyes searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who seemed genuinely determined to fix what had gone wrong. "I appreciate you stepping in," she said finally, her voice softening. "But this isn't just about me. If this is happening to other people, if there are systemic issues in your airline, it needs to stop." Mr. Harrington nodded firmly. "It will. I've already ordered a full investigation into the practices at our Atlanta terminal, and we're implementing new training programs across the board. We're also revising our reporting systems to ensure incidents like this are flagged and addressed immediately." For a moment, the weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. Danielle wanted to believe him, but years of encountering similar situations had taught her to be cautious. Words were easy, actions were what truly mattered. As the plane continued its journey, Danielle couldn't help but wonder how this story would end. Would the promises Mr. Harrington made lead to real change? Or would this just become another forgotten incident, lost in the shuffle of corporate damage control? One thing was certain, she wasn't going to let her voice be silenced. If this experience could shine a light on the larger issues at play, she was determined to see it through. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Danielle returned to her seat, her thoughts swirling. Mr. Harrington's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't erase the sting of what she had experienced. It wasn't just the humiliation at the gate, it was the deeper realization that such treatment was likely ingrained in a system that allowed it to persist. Despite Mr. Harrington's assurances, Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Change, especially on a systemic level, didn't come easily. Looking around the cabin, Danielle noticed a young flight attendant with dark hair and kind eyes hesitating near her row. Unlike Miss Fletcher, this attendant seemed unsure, almost hesitant to approach. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice quiet but sincere. "Excuse me, Miss Carter," she said, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry for what you went through earlier. It shouldn't have happened." Danielle offered a small smile, appreciating the gesture even though it didn't fully ease her frustration. "Thank you. I hope things like this don't happen to others." The attendant nodded quickly, glancing over her shoulder as though worried someone might overhear. "I have seen things before," she admitted in a hushed tone. Not exactly like this, but enough to know that something's wrong. If you need anything during the flight, please let me know. Danielle watched her walk away, a sense of unease settling in. This small confession, while well-meaning, only added to the weight of what Mr. Harrington had told her. It wasn't just an isolated incident. There was a pattern, a thread running through the organization that needed to be unraveled. But where would that thread lead, and how far did it go? The hours passed slowly, and as the plane began its descent, Danielle found herself drawn back to her conversation with Mr. Harrington. She wondered if his intervention had been spurred by genuine concern or by fear of what her story might do to the airline's reputation. Either way, she wasn't about to let this situation fade into the background. Danielle decided she would reach out to her contacts in the media if necessary. She wasn't looking for attention or revenge. She simply wanted accountability. When the plane touched down, Danielle gathered her belongings and prepared to deboard. As she reached the jet bridge, she noticed Mr. Harrington standing off to the side, speaking quietly with a man in a suit who looked like part of the airline's legal team. Their conversation seemed intense, and the way Mr. Harrington gestured toward the terminal suggested that whatever they were discussing was directly tied to her experience. Danielle hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Mr. Harrington," she said, interrupting their conversation. Both men turned to her, the lawyer's expression unreadable, while Mr. Harrington's face softened slightly. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to ask what happens next." Mr. Harrington nodded, his tone still measured. "I understand your concern, Ms. Carter. We'll be conducting an internal investigation starting immediately. I'll make sure you're kept informed of any developments." The lawyer stepped in, his voice smooth but cautious. "Ms. Carter, we also want to ensure that your experience is handled appropriately and that your voice is heard. If you're open to it, we'd like to schedule a formal meeting to go over the details of what happened." Danielle narrowed her eyes slightly, her instincts warning her to tread carefully. "I'll consider it," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "But I want to be clear, this isn't about me looking for compensation or a quick fix. This is about making sure no one else has to deal with what I did." The lawyer nodded, his smile tight. "Of course, and we respect that." As she walked away, Danielle couldn't help but feel that the lawyer's words were rehearsed, a calculated attempt to contain the situation. She was determined not to let this become another corporate cover-up. But she also knew she couldn't take on a company of this size alone. Danielle decided she would consult with a friend, Ashley, a civil rights attorney known for taking on cases that shined a light on systemic injustice. If anyone could help her navigate this, it was Ashley. That evening, as Danielle sat in her hotel room, she called Ashley and explained everything. Ashley listened intently, her tone thoughtful as she responded. "It sounds like you're dealing with more than just one bad apple," she said. "If this is part of a larger pattern within the airline, there could be grounds for a serious investigation. But we'd need to gather evidence, testimonies, and see if other passengers or employees have experienced similar treatment." Danielle leaned back in her chair, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. "I just want to make sure this leads to real change," she said. "It's not about me. It's about fixing the system." "And we will," Ashley assured her. "But be prepared. This won't be easy. Big corporations like this have deep pockets and entire teams dedicated to protecting their image. You'll need to be ready for whatever comes next." As the days passed, Danielle found herself pulled deeper into the complexities of what had happened. Ashley helped her draft a formal statement to the airline, demanding transparency and outlining the changes she wanted to see implemented. Meanwhile, Danielle began reaching out to other passengers who had flown with the airline, hoping to find others who might have faced similar treatment. What she discovered was both troubling and eye-opening. Stories of subtle discrimination, overlooked complaints, and employees who felt powerless to speak up. One former flight attendant, who asked to remain anonymous, confided in Danielle during a phone call. "I left because I couldn't take it anymore," she said. "The things I saw, the way some passengers and even staff were treated, it wasn't right. But every time I tried to speak up, I was shut down. They made it clear that keeping the company's reputation intact was more important than doing what was fair. Hearing these stories only fueled Danielle's determination. She began documenting everything, creating a detailed account of her experience and the stories she had collected. It wasn't just about one airline or one incident. It was about challenging the systems and structures that allowed such behavior to persist. But as Danielle worked tirelessly to build her case, she couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching her. Subtle things, a missed call from an unknown number, an email that seemed out of place, began to make her question whether the airline was trying to keep tabs on her. She shared her concerns with Ashley, who reminded her to stay vigilant and document everything. Danielle knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but she also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. She had been given a platform, a chance to speak up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And she wasn't about to let fear stop her now. Danielle felt the weight of everything mounting as she delved deeper into uncovering the truth. Each day brought more stories, more layers to peel back, and more pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow larger with every revelation. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. What she had stumbled upon appeared to be a systemic issue deeply rooted in the airline's culture. Yet, the closer she got to the truth, the more the stakes seemed to rise. One evening, Danielle received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering, her instincts on high alert. A muffled voice greeted her on the other end. "Miss Carter," the man said, his tone sharp but calm. "This is a courtesy call. Be careful where you tread. Not everything is as simple as it seems." Her heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" she demanded, gripping the phone tightly. "You don't need to know who I am," the man replied, his words chilling their detachment. "But you should consider letting this go. The more you dig, the harder it will get for you." The line went dead, leaving Danielle staring at her phone in disbelief. Was it a threat? A warning? Or simply an attempt to intimidate her? Whatever it was, it only strengthened her resolve. Someone wanted her to back down, and that meant she was onto something bigger than she had imagined. She immediately called Ashley, recounting the cryptic phone call. Ashley's response was swift and firm. "This is exactly why we need to push forward," she said. "They're scared, Danielle. Scared of what you might uncover. But we have to stay smart about this. Document everything and keep your guard up." The next day, Danielle found herself receiving an unexpected invitation from Mr. Harrington. He wanted to meet with her again, this time in his office. The tone of his email was formal, almost rehearsed, but she accepted. She wanted to see how far he was willing to go, and whether he was truly on her side. When she arrived at the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. Mr. Harrington greeted her personally, leading her into a sleek conference room. This time he wasn't alone. A small group of executives, including the same lawyer she'd seen before, sat waiting. Their expressions were a mix of politeness and wariness, as though they were trying to gauge just how much of a threat Danielle posed. "Miss Carter," Mr. Harrington began, his voice calm but measured, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We've been reviewing the concerns you raised, and we want to assure you that we're taking them seriously." Danielle crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I appreciate that, but words only mean so much. What actions are you taking to address the issues within your organization?" One of the executives, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, chimed in. "We're implementing a series of internal audits and mandatory diversity training for our staff. Additionally, we've placed certain employees under review based on your account." Danielle didn't miss the careful phrasing. "Under review," she repeated. "That doesn't sound like accountability to me. What about addressing the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place?" The room grew tense, and Mr. Harrington shifted in his seat. "Miss Carter, we're committed to change," he said. "But these things take time. We can't dismantle a system overnight." Danielle leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "Time isn't the issue. Commitment is. And right now, I don't see enough evidence that your airline is willing to go beyond surface-level fixes." The lawyer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "Miss Carter, We understand your passion, but we also need to ensure that any actions taken are fair and within legal boundaries. We're more than willing to work with you, but we ask that you allow us the space to address these matters internally." Danielle stared at him, the meaning behind his words clear. They wanted her to back off, to trust them to handle things quietly, but she knew better. If she let them control the narrative, nothing would change. "I'll give you space," she said finally, her tone sharp. "But only if I see real progress. Otherwise, I have no problem taking this public." The lawyer's jaw tightened, and Mr. Harrington gave her a small nod, as if acknowledging her resolve. "Understood," he said. "We'll be in touch." As Danielle left the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that the meeting had been more of a performance than a genuine attempt to address the problem. It was becoming increasingly clear that the airline's leadership was more concerned about protecting their reputation than creating meaningful change. Over the next few days, Danielle began to notice strange things happening. Her emails to other passengers went unanswered, and a few of the people she had spoken to earlier seemed hesitant to continue their conversations. One even admitted, in a hurried whisper, that they'd been contacted by the airline and asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Danielle realized that the airline was working behind the scenes to silence anyone who might corroborate her story. The tension reached a boiling point when Danielle discovered that her laptop had been tampered with. Files she had carefully organized were suddenly missing, and an unfamiliar program was running in the background. Panic set in as she called Ashley, who immediately advised her to take her laptop to a cybersecurity expert. The expert's findings were alarming. Someone had gained remote access to her device. "This isn't just intimidation," Ashley said when Danielle told her. "They're actively trying to undermine you. But this only proves how desperate they are. They maybe have something powerful." Danielle's fear was quickly replaced by determination. She decided to escalate her efforts, contacting investigative journalists who specialize in uncovering corporate corruption. If the airline thought they could bully her into silence, they were about to learn otherwise. But as she prepared to take her story public, she knew she was walking a fine line. The risks were higher than ever, and the pressure was mounting. On the surface, the airline was presenting a polished front, issuing statements about their commitment to diversity and inclusion. But behind the scenes, Danielle knew a battle was brewing. She could feel the walls closing in, the tension reaching its peak. Every move she made felt like a step closer to uncovering the truth, or walking straight into a trap. Danielle sat in her small apartment, staring at the glowing screen of her phone. The journalist she had contacted, a seasoned investigator named Clara Moreno, had just left her a cryptic voicemail. "Danielle, there's something you need to see," Clara had said. "I've been digging into the airline, and let's just say, it's bigger than either of us thought. Meet me at the cafe on 7th Avenue tomorrow. Noon, and come alone." Her mind raced with questions. What could Clara have uncovered? Could it be the smoking gun they needed to force the airline into accountability? Or was this just another piece of the sprawling puzzle she'd been piecing together? Danielle barely slept that night, her thoughts a jumble of hope, fear, and determination. The next day, she arrived at the cafe early, scanning the room for Clara. The journalist was sitting in a corner booth, a laptop open, and a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She waved Danielle over, her expression serious. "Thanks for coming," Clara said as Danielle slid into the seat across from her. "What I'm about to show you might change everything." Clara leaned in, lowering her voice. "While investigating the airline, I found something that shocked even me. It's not just about discrimination. It's about a cover-up. Over the past 5 years, there have been multiple incidents similar to yours, but they were buried. Complaints mysteriously disappeared, and employees who tried to speak out were silenced. Some were even fired under dubious circumstances." Danielle's stomach turned. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Clara pulled up a document on her laptop and turned it toward Danielle. It was an internal memo, stamped with the airline's logo, detailing a strategy for minimizing reputational risk. The language was cold and clinical, outlining steps to suppress complaints and handle problematic individuals discreetly. "I got this from a whistleblower," Clara said. Someone inside the company who's been wanting to speak out for years but was too afraid. Danielle stared at the memo, a mix of anger and disbelief rising in her chest. "This is proof," she said, her voice shaking. "Proof that they knew what was happening and chose to cover it up." Clara nodded. "It gets worse," she said, pulling out another sheet of paper. "This is a list of payouts, hush money given to employees and passengers to keep them quiet. Your gate agent, Miss Fletcher. She's on the list. It looks like she's been involved in multiple incidents, but instead of addressing the behavior, the airline paid off the victims and kept her on staff." Danielle felt her hands clench into fists. All the anger and humiliation she had felt at the gate came flooding back, now magnified by the knowledge that it wasn't an isolated incident. "This has to go public," she said. "People need to know what's really happening." Clara hesitated. "I agree, but we have to be strategic," she said. "The airline will do everything in its power to discredit us. They might even come after you personally. Are you ready for that?" Danielle didn't hesitate. "I don't care what they throw at me. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced. I'm not backing down." But just as they were wrapping up their meeting, Danielle's phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it and froze. The subject line read, ***Cs and desist ***. And the sender was the airline's legal team. The message was clear. If she continued to spread defamatory claims, they would take legal action against her. Attached to the email was a copy of a lawsuit they were prepared to file, along with a stern warning to stay silent. Danielle showed the email to Clara, who shook her head grimly. "They're trying to scare you," she said. "It's a classic tactic. They want you to think you're powerless." But Danielle wasn't scared. She was furious. She called Ashley, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "They sent me a cease and desist," she said. "But I'm not stopping. If anything, this proves we're on the right track." Ashley agreed. "This is exactly what we expected," she said. "And it means they're nervous. But we need to be smart. Let's draft a response and make it clear that we're not backing down." As the days passed, the tension only grew. Danielle and Clara worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing to go public with the story. But just when they thought they were ready, another twist emerged. Clara received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have direct knowledge of the airline's practices. The tipster wanted to meet in person, insisting they had information that would blow the case wide open. Danielle and Clara decided to meet the tipster together, choosing a public location for safety. The man, who introduced himself as Eli, was nervous and fidgety, glancing around as though he expected to be followed. "I used to work in their compliance department," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw things that still keep me up at night." Eli handed Clara a USB drive. "Everything you need is on there," he said. Internal emails, reports, even recordings of meetings where they discussed how to handle problem passengers. "But be careful. They don't play fair. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Before Danielle or Clara could ask more questions, Eli stood abruptly. "I've already said too much," he muttered before disappearing into the crowd. Back at Clara's office, they plugged in the USB drive and began sifting through its contents. What they found was explosive. The emails revealed a coordinated effort to suppress complaints, with executives openly discussing how to manage incidents to avoid bad press. One recording even captured a senior executive instructing staff to prioritize the company's image over fairness or accountability. As Danielle listened to the recording, her anger boiled over. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with both rage and determination. "This is the proof we need." But just as they were preparing to release the story, Danielle received another call, this time from an unfamiliar number. When she answered, a voice she didn't recognize spoke, its tone low and menacing. "You think you've won, don't you?" The voice said. "You have no idea what you're up against. If you go through with this, you'll regret it." Danielle's heart pounded, but she refused to let the fear take over. "We'll see about that," she said before hanging up. She turned to Clara, her eyes blazing with determination. "Let's finish this." Danielle's pulse raced as she and Clara finalized the story, preparing to release it to a major news outlet. The evidence from Ellie's USB drive was damning, far worse than they had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of negligence. It was a deliberate and systemic effort to protect the airline's profits at the expense of justice. The recordings, the memos, the payout logs, each piece was a nail in the coffin of the airline's credibility. Yet, even with all this evidence, Danielle couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The threats, the tampering with her files, and now the ominous phone call. It all pointed to an opponent who wouldn't go down quietly. The night before the story was set to go live, Danielle received an email from Clara. The journalist had been contacted by someone claiming to represent a group of former employees who wanted to come forward publicly. Danielle felt a surge of hope. More voices meant more power behind their story. But as Clara explained the details of the meeting she had planned for the next morning, Danielle couldn't help but feel a twinge of caution. Why now? Why were these employees stepping forward so suddenly? The next day, Danielle joined Clara at the agreed-upon location, a small conference room in a co-working space. The atmosphere was tense as they waited for the group to arrive. When the door finally opened, a middle-aged woman in a crisp blazer stepped in, flanked by two men in suits. They introduced themselves as former employees who had worked at various levels of the airline, from customer service to upper management. "We've seen what's happening with your story," the woman said, her tone even but firm. "And we believe it's time for the truth to come out. But you need to understand, what we're dealing with goes beyond what you've uncovered so far." Danielle and Clara exchanged a glance. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, leaning forward. The woman hesitated, her eyes scanning the room as though she expected someone to be listening. "The airline isn't just protecting its reputation," she said. "It's protecting its stakeholders. There are powerful people behind the scenes who have a vested interest in keeping all of this quiet. If you go public, you won't just be facing the airline. You'll be facing them." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Danielle felt her resolve waver for the first time. Could they really take on something this big? But before she could respond, one of the men stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. "This," he said, "is everything we have. Contracts, emails, financial statements. It proves the lengths they've gone to in order to cover up not just discrimination, but fraud, embezzlement, and worse. If you're going to fight them, you'll need this." Clara opened the folder, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. This is huge," she murmured. "If this gets out, it won't just bring down the airline. It could lead to criminal charges." But the woman interrupted. "There's a catch," she said. "If you use this, they'll come after you with everything they've got. And I mean everything. You'll need to be prepared for that." Danielle sat back, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had already risked so much, but this was on another level. Yet as she thought about everything she had endured, and everything others like her had faced, she knew she couldn't walk away now. "We'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what it takes." The following days were a whirlwind. Clara worked tirelessly to vet the new evidence, ensuring its authenticity. Danielle braced herself for the inevitable backlash, knowing they were about to shake the foundation of one of the world's most powerful airlines. When the story finally broke, it was a bombshell. Headlines screamed of corruption and cover-ups, and the recordings from Ellie's USB drive went viral, sparking outrage across social media. People from all over the world shared their own stories of mistreatment by the airline, and protests erupted outside its headquarters. For a moment, it seemed like they had won. The airline's CEO, under immense pressure, issued a public apology and announced his resignation. Internal investigations were launched, and government regulators began probing the company's practices. Danielle felt a sense of vindication as she watched the tide turn, knowing her fight had made a real impact. But just as she allowed herself to breathe, the unexpected twist came. Late one evening, she received a call from Clara, her voice trembling with urgency. "Danielle, I just found something in the financial records from that folder," Clara said. It's not what we thought. The airline wasn't just protecting itself, it was acting on behalf of someone else. There's a shadow investor, a private equity firm with ties to some very powerful people. They're the ones who orchestrated the cover-up, and they're already moving to distance themselves from the fallout. Danielle's stomach dropped. What does that mean for us? She asked. It means the fight isn't over, Kara replied. We've exposed the airline, but the real players are still out there. And they're going to do everything they can to make sure the trail ends here. As Danielle hung up the phone, she realized the battle she had thought was over was only just beginning. The airline might have fallen, but the system that allowed it to thrive was still intact. And now she was more determined than ever to bring it down.